Okay, guys, I'm gonna talk about UFC Africa. We know that Dana White has confirmed that there will be a UFC Africa card next year. That he is looking to expand into new territories, and obviously Africa would have been like one of his desires. Excuse me. So that is positive news. It's not new news either. Um, what was mentioned that has been new news is the reasons why Dana doesn't want to do an open stadium event, and I understand where he's coming from, but I don't go to school on the back of a lion, and I don't drive on dirt roads, and I say this with respect because even in school, when we played rugby, you had a lot of these guys coming over, in exchange student program kind of a thing. Excuse me, at our school, like just students, and then obviously every year there would be a team from overseas that we'd play, and then those guys would come and stay at our house. In my particular year, it was a school from Wales. So just making the jokes with the guys when they arrived at the school as to hey, I stay in a shack, or I've got a pet lion and stuff. And you'd be surprised just by American society as well how many people believe some of the bullshit that we say. And I think it's just propaganda about like South Africa to America, that we stay in this like shanty town of a country, which is just not true. There's a lot of amazing places in South Africa which are completely first world, which you wouldn't say you are in the South Africa that you think it is like. There's definitely stadiums in this country and places in this country where you're not going to have to worry about heat, you're not going to have to worry about bugs, you're not going to have to worry about the experience and it affecting your clients that are obviously paying to travel to watch the UFC in a kind of Thriller in Manila, Rumble in the Jungle-esque kind of UFC fight card. I don't think that if there's certain places, I don't think that if there was a event, you'd ever have to worry about bugs and things of that nature, just purely based on the fact that there's PSL games, there's concerts, there's other sports that kind of participate in open stadium events, and there's no such of that nature. So I think it's a bit of a cop out from Dana White, if I'm being honest. I just think that there's a lot of logistics involved, there's a lot of planning involved, there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that's involved in obviously the UFC doing an open stadium event. But I do think that it's much better for the UFC to start doing open stadium events if they do want to take over the global sports landscape and become a media conglomerate, like how I see them wanting to be and how I see them in the future being, if they don't start doing open stadium events. Because not everywhere they go to is gonna build a 80,000 seater arena, and there aren't that many 80,000 seater arenas, and like Madison Square Garden, if I'm not mistaken, was like 20,000. So they need to do bigger gates, and they need to kind of do the open stadium thing, so they can also do the events around the open stadium thing, like how we have a Springbok game, then we have Boktown, where the Springbok game is happening at Greenpoint Stadium in Cape Town, but we've got a Boktown here in Durban, we've got a Boktown in Jozi, we've got a Boktown in Bloemfontein, we've got a Boktown in Quebec, which is Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape, and across various other cities in the country, smaller towns as well. So I think that's where I would like the UFC Africa to go, which is definitely look, I'm fully confident that we have the skills, we have the people, we have the intelligence, we have the resources, the infrastructure, the financing, the backing globally to actually build a new arena in certain locations, and obviously say UFC, you're doing this to be doing this, and then obviously depends on how many times the UFC is going to come back, regardless if you have a champion or not. Obviously the numbers are going to have to be around, the tests are going to have to be conducted, but I think that South Africa does have the ability to say, okay, look, UFC, here's your arena, and stuff of that nature. But I think the UFC are missing out on a big market when it comes to doing open stadium events. The gates and attendance would be huge, you know. Obviously the surrounding events as well will be huge. You know, I think they're missing out on a lot of money if they don't think about open stadium events, and it's not just in South Africa as well. I think if they're looking at these new and emerging markets, like if the UFC has to now go to London or the UK and then do one at Old Trafford or Anfield or Stamford Bridge, stuff of that nature, and then now obviously go to Brazil, but instead of going to Brazil, do it in a stadium, or if they come to South Africa, doing it in a stadium, or if they're going to like in the east, to do it in a stadium, to go to Spain as well and to do it in the Bernabeu. You know, they're missing on a lot of revenue. Just also as well in the US, you know, doing stuff at their own stadiums, bringing the fight nights and the bare knuckle and the power slap to the obviously like the college stadiums and stuff of that nature. They're missing on a lot of money if they think that they're always gonna just stick to this model, which is we're always gonna do a closed arena. I think it's very short-sighted of the UFC. I think they're leaving a lot of money on the table. I don't think a player as small as them in the global landscape can afford the opportunity to leave so much money on the table. I think that obviously TKO, having bought the UFC, was looking at the UFC eventually becoming like I said, one of the leaders in sports entertainment. So I don't think that TKO themselves would be also happy with just leaving the business model that we're only doing closed arena events, and if we're expanding new territories and exploring new territories, then it has to be a closed arena, and that government or that particular territory needs to build an arena for the UFC. I think it's not smart business. I think the UFC also getting into politics was good, but now it becomes the question of how much are the UFC going to play and affect global politics. Because if I had to just reason from our side, and look, South Africa is very much the referee of global politics, is very much on the fence and mediator of global politics, and we have very key and strategic relationships. Obviously we've got BRICS, and we've got the AGOA agreement, and we've got G20 and our new stuff that we've got with the UK as well. And I just think it would be foolish for the UFC to be the reason that South Africa now favors business relationships with China and Russia as opposed to the US, because I definitely think that this is something, the UFC coming to Africa and then using South Africa is something where if the UFC are playing hardball, it will affect the global politics, and it will affect how obviously South Africa sees the US, how South Africa will be seeing President-elect Donald Trump, and it will give obviously other global players the avenue to kind of sow those seeds on the US government, on US politics, and then the new US president, Donald J. Trump, if this UFC card doesn't happen, and if it is difficult for this UFC card to happen. Because I think it's important also for the UFC to remember that for something like this to come to South Africa or Africa, it affects the global economy. It affects the macro economy within the country. It affects the job market. It affects unemployment. It affects the crime rates. It affects the overall public morale. It affects policy, regulation, and like I said, global politics. How this country will see the US as a partner, as an ally, or will they side with adversaries of the US? I think it's also important to think of when the UFC is deciding what they say about certain events and how they plan on doing things, because at the end of the day, the UFC did decide to politicize themselves by standing with Trump, and I hate to see that like the UFC being a reason why a country which is as strategic and integral for the US to have an ally in Africa like South Africa is incredibly integral for Donald J. Trump's plans. So I don't think it's a good idea for the UFC, who've already politicized themselves and taken that risk, to now then be the reason why a country like South Africa runs to the adversaries of the US and starts cozying up to the likes of the Chinas and the likes of the Russias. So I'm not saying that's the case. I'm not saying it's happening, but I do think that the UFC needs to think about that before they just blanketly say that they're only doing closed arena events, not open stadium events, just purely based on the fact that, look, South Africa is very close allies with Brazil as well. I think India is a huge market for the UFC, and I just don't think you can run around telling people that they need to list all these demands, and then they need to fulfill all your requirements in order for you to come there, when you also need those markets as well. You know, the UFC needs a market like South Africa because the UFC is predominantly watched by, like, you know, aging white males, which is like a dying breed basically, and they need a new audience like my age. They need the hip hop audience, they need the popular culture audience, they need fans of other sports to start watching the UFC. They need that cross pollination to happen. So I think that, you know, not taking advantage of that is just foolish from the UFC's part. I also think the UFC is not just a standalone company. I think it's owned by TKO and Endeavor. So I think Mr. Emmanuel needs to, like, kind of obviously be taken into account, and his opinions to be taken into account, which is that the UFC did politicize themselves, and it's a high risk, high reward kind of situation, and it could affect the relationship between the US and South Africa if the South Africa UFC did not happen. I think the UFC would be losing out on a huge untapped emerging market, which obviously, you know, the largest growing population of youth is in Africa. Obviously, we know that the UFC's predominant fan base is like the aging white male, which needs to change. They need younger fans. They need a more diverse range of fans, and it's not going to happen if they don't start catering for other markets and being cognizant of their requirements, their demands, their amnesties, what is available to them. And I just think that the UFC as well are going to lose a lot by not coming to Africa next year. They are generally going to lose a lot. There's a lot of deals that are already happening between the countries of Africa and other countries, which the US aren't part and privy of, and that is only going to increase if the UFC doesn't come and do their part. Obviously, it was their own decision to politicize themselves as an organization and as a business. So now the onus is on them to kind of play their part on behalf of US politics and the Trump administration, to kind of showcase that, you know what, this is not how Trump is, this is not how his administration is, this is not how supporters of Trump's administration are. It's not on us to prove to our locals and our people that you guys aren't like this. It's up to you guys to prove that you aren't like that, you know. So I think that if the UFC just wants to stay as this bespoke kind of like one-off sports entertainment company that very few people watch, that is incredibly, you know, marginalized, and it's very it's just a small bracket of a niche market, then they can carry on doing what they want. But if they aren't going to new territories, if they aren't exploring new options, new ways to merchandise, if they aren't using what they already did, which is politicize themselves as an organization to their advantage, then they're not just leaving money on the table. The business is going to shrink. You know, they need to be looking at open stadium events, like I said, for their local markets, for incorporating the collegiate football sector there, you know, in terms of UFC fight nights, BKFC and Power Slap, and then obviously looking at India, looking at Spain, looking at Brazil, looking at South Africa and Africa. Open stadium events do need to happen for the UFC. There's no other way around it. Every new territory is not going to build an arena for Dana White. You know, I'm sure he would like that. If I was Dana White, I would like that too, but it just isn't feasible for the global economy unless he's going to finance it himself. You know, so I think that on a scale, the UFC needs these markets and emerging markets more than they need the UFC. And I think it also has global political ramifications and economic ramifications, whereby if the UFC, which is now the representation of Donald Trump and his administration, does not play the right cards, and does not think about the long game, you're going to see a lot of allies that the UFC and Trump administration need end up going and siding with rivals and adversaries of the US, which you can't blame them for doing, and it's only a matter of time before the UFC's rivals start making deals with these governments to do the events that the UFC don't want to do, and then next thing you know, the UFC aren't just not taking over the sports entertainment industry, but their competitors are taking their market share. So I think it has a lot of potential to be good, but it also has a lot of potential to be grim, and it's for the UFC to decide what they want to do. At the same time, as much as I can say, like, hey, we got the people to obviously open an arena, and we got the infrastructure and the capabilities to do so. There's a lot of markets that the UFC do need to go to which aren't able to do that. And even if those markets were able to do that, and those countries were able to do that, it makes more sense for the UFC to still do an open stadium event like the Bernabeu. Like, no matter what, even if they can build an arena, if they have arenas, it still makes sense for the UFC to do Spain in Bernabeu. So it's up to them. As I said, it's their decision, but I would hate to see the UFC be the reason why the Trump administration loses allies of his administration before he's even sworn in. I would hate to see the UFC shrink and their competitors take their market share. I would hate to see the UFC not even get into the top 3 of global sports in terms of viewership because of their own stupidity. So like I said, it just depends on them, but they can't be like this ego and arrogant thing about them anymore, which is what's kind of being like the standard when it comes to the UFC and the decisions, where they just have this ego and they're just incredibly arrogant and think like the world is run by them because like they are the smallest fish in the pond, and if they are going to want to take over the global sports landscape, then they are going to have to play the game, not think they own the game. Because yeah, you're the biggest MMA organization, but no one fucking knows about MMA, bro. Like, no one knows, and no one gives a fuck. People would rather watch Jake Paul box than actual seasoned fighters fight, and I think that is important, where you gotta say like, am I doing my job? If a kid would rather watch Jake Paul fuck up a 58-year-old man than watch the greatest athlete of all time fights, right, then you need to ask yourself, am I doing my job correctly? Because the middle-aged white men will always give you their money, sure, but you need people of color, young people, females as well, to find it cool to watch UFC, to like for their boyfriends to be like, hey, we're going to the UFC, and for it to be a thing, or so it's not that yet. None of the fighters are household names, not even McGregor, so there's a lot of growth that needs to happen in the UFC, and yeah, they've done well and stuff of that nature, but even if they've done well, they can always do better. And considering that they want to take on world football and the US football and basketball and baseball and cricket and stuff of that nature, they have a lot of work to do, and I think just sticking solely to only arenas is not the way. I think they're going to lose a lot of market share from their competitors. They're going to fuck up Donald Trump's foreign policy because they themselves politicize themselves as an organization, and they're not going to be able to take on the other sports in the global sports arena if they keep on playing the same way. So I guess the ball is in their court. We're going to have to wait and see what they say.